Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of digital fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and today we have all of the weekend spoilers that dropped over the weekend. Days 6 and 7 of spoiler season, all rounded up into one video for you guys. A lot of crazy stuff dropped, not as many rares as in previous days, but still a lot of pretty crazy uncommons, and the rares that we did see are looking pretty gnarly. So we're going to dive right in, try to get through these as quick as possible. Before we do, make sure you like the video if you haven't already. We screamed right past 10K subscribers. We're almost to 11, and that's thanks to all of you liking the video. So please, please, please hit that like button. Let's make sure this video gets in front of that many more people. Also, if you're new here, make sure you subscribe so you never miss an upload. Tons of spoiler content still to come, and a ridiculous amount of crazy deck ideas that are already brewing in my head that are going to hit the channel as deck techs. We are a part of early access for Duskmourn. That's happening on September 18th. And I'm doing a 24-hour marathon stream where we're going to try all of the crazy new standard ideas that I can possibly think of, and all of those deck techs are going to go live on YouTube starting that very day and every day after that, so look forward to that. We'll see you there, but for now, let's check out today's spoiler cards. This is Irreverent Gremlin, 1 red and 1 for a 2/2 Gremlin with Menace. Whenever another creature you control with power 2 or less enters, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card, but do this only once each turn. This guy's fine for limited. I don't think he quite makes the cut in constructed unless there's a self-mill deck that uses red that really cares about activating this ability every turn, but being able to rummage once a turn, every turn, if you're consistently dropping 2 power creatures, is not nothing, right? And in limited, it's going to be really good because it's going to help you dig and find that bomb as quick as possible, while also setting up things like Delirium and Threshold and that sort of thing. And just having a 2/2 Menace body for 2 is also nothing to scoff at. So I like this guy a lot in limited, and under just the right circumstances, he might show up in standard, but we'll have to wait and see. Next up, we've got Wildfire Wickerfolk. This is a 3/2 artifact creature Scarecrow with haste for 2 mana in the colors of Gruul, and it also has Delirium, so it gets +1/+1 and Trample as long as there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard. This card is just amazing. A 3/2 haste for 2 is already pretty good, right? And then the fact that if you can trigger Delirium easy enough, it just comes out as a 4/3 haste trample for 2 mana. That's just absurd, especially when you consider the fact that this is an uncommon, which means it's going to show up fairly often in limited. You're going to be able to draft it super high because this thing is going to go away. And there's even some little bits of extra value built in, like the fact that it counts as an artifact because it's an artifact creature. So things that care about artifacts are going to care about this card. It's just good, right? There isn't a whole lot of deep diving to do on this one. It's just awesome. It's good even if you're not in a consistent Delirium deck. But if you're in a consistent Delirium deck, it's even better. 4/3 haste trample for 2 mana is nuts. It's just nuts. Now granted, most of the time you're not going to be able to trigger that Delirium by turn 2. But any subsequent copies you draw into later in the game will definitely be coming out as more relevant threats. And that is very meaningful. So I love this card. Definitely one of the better cards we've seen for limited so far. Next up, we've got Horrid Vigor. This is 1 green and 1 for an instant. Target creature gains Death Touch and Indestructible until end of turn. So nice little bit of common combat trickery for limited, specifically instant speed. Make sure your guy survives no matter what. Make sure their guy dies no matter what. It's the next best thing to removal. But in some situations, it's going to be slightly better than removal because you're going to be able to save a guy that maybe otherwise couldn't be saved. So nice little bit of trickery here. It is a common, so it'll be easy to just kind of grab something like this later in the draft if you're coming up short on combat tricks or removal. Next up, we've got Rite of the Moth. This card is nuts for an uncommon. This is 4 mana, 2 black, 1 white, and 1 in the colors of Orzhov. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. The fact that this is only 4 mana, it almost doesn't matter that you get the finality counter. If you're in the kind of deck that wants to run this, just 4 mana, no hoops reanimation for any creature in your graveyard, by the time, you know, that thing goes away and gets exiled instead of going back to your graveyard, you're probably going to have plenty of other things in your graveyard to be able to get with the next Reanimator spell, regardless of the first thing getting removed because of a finality counter. So I don't really think that finality counter matters all that much. And if you care that much, you could always just flicker the thing that you bring back and it comes back onto the battlefield with no finality counter. So that could be pretty wild. And as if having just a 4 mana uncommon no hoops reanimation spell wasn't good enough, it also has flashback for 6 mana. So you could just get another creature later on. And like I said, with the finality counter, the first thing you bring back will get exiled. So it's not like you're going to have that as the same target when you flash this back later. But like I said, any deck that wants to run this kind of card, that's going to be building around this kind of card, it's going to have plenty of choices for other cards that are just as good or better than the first thing that you brought back by the time you have this 6 mana to flash this back. So this is kind of everything I want. Super cheap reanimation spell. We can run standard reanimator now and reanimate things consistently a turn earlier than we usually can in a standard reanimator deck, and just flash it back later for extra value. So I just love this thing. I think it's awesome. Am I too high on this? I don't know. Let me know in the comments. But next up, we've got Vengeful Possession. This is 1 red and 2 for a sorcery. Gain control of target creature until end of turn. Untap it. It gains haste until end of turn. You may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. So this is the threaten ability for the set. And it's not super interesting. We've seen a lot more inventive, you know, versions of threaten in previous sets. It seems like every set gets some sort of version of this card. That being said, it is a pretty solid version, right? Getting to discard a card and draw a card in a set that cares about things like Delirium and Threshold and Flashback and that sort of stuff is actually a lot better than it looks on the surface when you take into account the rest of the set and you know, the limited environment that this is going to be a part of. So, you know, getting to threaten their dude while also working into those synergies is actually pretty cool. Next up, we've got Baseball Bat. This is 2 mana in the colors of Selesnya for an artifact equipment, and when it enters, you get to attach it to target creature you control for free, which is nice. Otherwise, it equips for 3. The equipped creature gets +1/+1, and whenever equipped creature attacks, you tap up to 1 target creature. Now, this is mainly meant to be used in Limited for sure, and it's going to be really good in Limited because it can specifically not have to pay the equip cost the turn that you play it, so it very cheaply attaches to your most relevant creature on the board. Not only makes it a little bit bigger, but can tap down their most problematic blockers. So if there's some kind of a Selesnya aggro deck where you just want to be as aggressive as possible, I think this can slot in pretty well. And then if that creature ever dies, you can just pay the equip cost to re-equip it to something else. But keep in mind the fact that this attaches for free when it enters the battlefield, because we haven't seen that for a number of sets now, and equipments that do that tend to be a lot better than equipments that don't, because you don't have to worry about getting so behind on tempo when you're playing these equipments. So I think this will be pretty good in Limited. It's not really going to make the cut Constructed, but it's not really meant for that either. Next up, we've got House Cartographer. 1 green and 1 for a 2/2 Human Scout Survivor with Survival. At the beginning of your second main phase, if House Cartographer is tapped, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a land card. Put that card into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. I feel like we get a card like this every set now, where there's some kind of a set mechanic version of being able to reveal a certain number of cards from the top of your library and snatch a land. This one is better than most, I think. The fact that it's a survival ability can just trigger for free after an attack if you manage to keep the Cartographer alive, or trigger for free if you find all of these other ways of tapping down the Cartographer. Makes it pretty decent. I think you could do a lot worse than to run this in your Limited deck. Will it be good enough for Constructed? Probably not, but we have seen cards like this actually end up making a splash in Constructed in the past, because there's interesting ways to synergize and get value off of it at very little cost. So I don't know if there's some way of making this work super efficiently. without having to jump through a whole bunch of hoops. This could see play in Constructed. Let me know in the comments if you have an idea about how this could be used in Standard, but my bet is that it's probably just relegated to Limited, but it'll be pretty good in that deck. Next up, we've got the Tale of 𝑇ℎ𝑒𝑚𝑒, our first rare of the day. This is 1 blue and 2 for a legendary enchantment saga, and thematically, it's kind of the return of 𝑇ℎ𝑒𝑚𝑒 in a way. It has chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4. On the first 3 chapters, you mill 2 cards. If 2 cards that share a card type were milled this way, you draw a card and repeat the process. Now, when I put this card out as a short on the channel, I did see some comments about people confused about being able to keep repeating the process. You can, in fact, just keep repeating this process over and over and over again every single time the 2 cards you mill share a card type, because it repeats the entire process. It's all one sentence, so repeating this process is a part of the process that gets repeated. So some clarification for those of you out there who don't think this can just keep triggering every time it hits 2 cards that share a card type, because it absolutely can. And in that way, I think this card can be super abusable in decks that build around it properly. You could play artifact lands. There's enough artifact lands in older formats that you could play all artifact lands as your entire mana base, and then play all artifacts other than Tale of 𝑇ℎ𝑒𝑚𝑒, and pretty much just draw your entire deck. Is there some kind of a combo deck that can be assembled around that? Probably. I'm not going to worry about figuring that out right now, because I'm more focused on trying to figure out all the crazy new standard brews. But if you think you've got it figured out, you know how you can break this card in older formats, definitely let me know in the comments. But we're going to try and see what we can come up with this for Standard specifically during early access. I feel like there's a lot of value here that can be harnessed. And don't forget, on chapter 4, you also exile any number of target instant, sorcery, and or 𝑇ℎ𝑒𝑚𝑒 Planeswalker cards from your graveyard, copy them, and you may cast any number of the copies. This is really interesting. Obviously, this card's going to be a lot better in sort of like a spell slinger deck, any kind of deck that's filling up the graveyard with instants and sorceries. But that last part, the 𝑇ℎ𝑒𝑚𝑒 Planeswalker, that's what has me interested, because they're going to want this card to be usable in Standard for the long haul. You got to remember, guys, Standard rotation is 3 years now, and I have a hard time believing that this card will exist in a Standard environment that doesn't have a single 𝑇ℎ𝑒𝑚𝑒 Planeswalker to grab from the graveyard with that Chapter 4 ability. So I almost see this as a hint that 𝑇ℎ𝑒𝑚𝑒 will come back as a Planeswalker at some point. Is that a tinfoil hat, conspiracy theory? Maybe. But I just find it really hard to believe that this would be in Standard for 3 years with such a specific line of text without there being a 𝑇ℎ𝑒𝑚𝑒 Planeswalker to grab with it. So I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to say 𝑇ℎ𝑒𝑚𝑒 is coming back in a future set. Pretty much confirmed. I would say this 99% confirms it, at least in my head, unless �WotC is a bunch of idiots, which maybe they are. I don't know. It's hard to say. But either way, this card is super cool, and the fact that 𝑇ℎ𝑒𝑚𝑒 at least comes back in spirit within this legendary saga is pretty awesome. Love seeing 𝑇ℎ𝑒𝑚𝑒. My eyes are looking forward to that next Planeswalker, though. You know it's going to happen. Next up, we've got Fear of Being Hunted. This is 2 red and 1 for a 4/2 enchantment creature nightmare with haste, and Fear of Being Hunted must be blocked if able. Nice little creature. You got to remember, it counts as an enchantment, and there are a lot of things in this set that really care about enchantments, such as the eerie keyword, stuff like that. So it's not just a 4/2 haste that has to be blocked. It's a little bit better than that, and it's really easy to overlook the fact that it's a little bit better than that because you're not used to the set as a whole yet. It's the middle of spoiler season. We haven't even seen the whole thing. But keep in mind, this is going to be a little bit better than it looks. All of these enchantment creatures are going to be better than they look because of all the ways they synergize with enchantment matters type stuff that's coming in the set. So, nice little card here. But next up, we've got Fear of Falling, another fear in the fear cycle. This is a 4/4 enchantment creature nightmare for 2 blue and 3 with flying, and when it attacks, target creature defending player controls gets -2/-0 and loses flying until your next turn. This is actually way better than it looks. I think this card is going to be a serious contender as a very high pick. I don't know if I'd go first pickable, but a very high pick win condition in blue, because evasion is somewhat rare and limited to begin with. Like, you normally sort of train yourself to pick evasive creatures high because they can just win games. A lot of times the board stalls out with no one in the air, and if you can have a flyer, you can just get through for damage every turn and win the game. A lot of limited board states end up looking that way, so the fact that you can have a 4/4 flyer, which is reasonable for 5 mana anyway, that can make sure that their one flyer they happen to get out, it doesn't have flying and can't block it, is actually pretty substantial. You're almost always going to win the race, and a lot of times, even if your opponent can get a flyer onto the battlefield to trade with this thing, or to chump block it, or whatever, or even just to race you with it, like, they're probably only going to get the one, right? It's hard enough to come up with one evasive creature in limited, but multiples is pretty tough, and even if they do have multiples, you get to choose which one loses flying. So if they get a big flyer out and then a crappy flyer out, you just make the big flyer lose flying, and you still get through unless they chump block, and you get card advantage by eating up their dudes. So I just think this is an insane win condition. It gives your opponent -1 flyer basically, and is a relevant threat at 4 power. So I don't know, maybe I'm too high on this, but I think it's going to be amazing in limited. Let me know if you agree in the comments. But we're going to move on. This is Oblivious Bookworm. This is 2 mana in the colors of Simic for a 2/3 human wizard. At the beginning of your end step, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card unless a permanent entered the battlefield face down under your control this turn, or you turned a permanent face up this turn. This is kind of awesome. A 2 mana 2/3 that just lets you loot every turn for free is already kind of good. I remember when Merfolk Looter was a really good card in limited, and you had to pay mana to use that ability. This just happens every turn for free. You still get to keep it up as a blocker. That alone seems really good. But if you happen to be in a deck that's playing a lot of face down creatures or turning permanents face up, like, it's not even a looter, it just draws you a card every turn, that's insane. It's going to be especially good in limited, obviously, just because the power level of limited is a lot less than constructed, so the power level of any single card is a little bit better when it's something like this that's at least on rate for a 2-drop. But what I'm really curious about is, can we put this to good use in standard, where we have access to way more things that can be played as face down creatures or turn permanents face up? If we make a disguise / cloak / manifest dread deck with Oblivious Bookworm, it could end up being insane. I think it's worth at least trying. I can't think of exactly what that deck list looks like right now, and what kind of cards can get the most value out of the Oblivious Bookworm. Another thing to note, though, is that with something like Delny, you could get double triggers on this, which is also kind of cool. And Delny will work with all of your disguised creatures, face down creatures, because they're all 2/2s. So maybe something like that. I don't know, let me know in the comments if you think of a crazy way to synergize these abilities, in a standard deck specifically, but really in any constructed deck. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are, but even in just limited, I think this guy is going to be amazing. It's great even without the face down stuff, so even if you just have a couple cards in the deck, just by chance that happen to be like Manifest Dread or whatever, as just a little bit of extra every now and then that you can possibly hit with the Bookworm, even just that is going to be really, really good, when the card is just going to be so good even without any. But next up, we've got Erratic Apparition, 1 blue and 2 for a 1/3 spirit with flying and vigilance, and it has Eerie, so whenever an enchantment you control enters and whenever you fully unlock a room, Erratic Apparition gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Not too bad. If you can consistently trigger this once a turn, it's a 2/4 flying attacker that can also block as a 1/3 flyer, which isn't bad for 3 mana. But at the end of the day, it's just a common, it's meant to fill that 3-drop slot if you're coming up short on quality creatures at the 3-drop slot, specifically in decks that are built around a lot of enchantments or a room deck that's going to be able to utilize this Eerie ability as much as possible. So if you're in those decks and you're coming up short on 3-drops, you can pick these up pretty easily towards the end of a draft, I think, and make it work. Next up, we've got Boilerbilges Ripper. This is a 4/4 human assassin for 1 red and 4, and when Boilerbilges Ripper enters, you may sacrifice another creature or enchantment. When you do, it deals 2 damage to any target. I don't hate this. It's definitely only useful in limited. It's just too expensive and too situational for constructed, absolutely. But in limited, getting a 4/4 that can actually be removal for something else as well, getting the opportunity to sacrifice something that might be negligible like a token creature, or even just a really cheap token enchantment like a Glimmer enchantment creature token or whatever, getting a little extra value is pretty nice. You can do 2 damage to any target too. So if you get this later in the game and your opponent's almost dead, you can use it to finish them off. You can use it to kill the new Kaito Planeswalker if you want. There's a little bit of versatility there. So as a common, it's nice. You maybe throw one of these in your deck, you know, if you have very valuable ways to trigger it by getting rid of, like, you know, little silver lining creatures or enchantments where you're not sacrificing anything of super value, you know, to get the trigger. But at the end of the day, this is just limited filler. The one thing I do love about this card is it's more confirmation that we're getting a ton more assassin support. So I definitely want to build assassins in standard. This card will almost definitely not be a part of it, but assassins in standard is definitely gonna make a resurgence. I love my assassin deck from a couple sets ago, and I'm so excited to rework it with some of the new powerful assassins. Next up, we've got Under the Skin. 1 green and 2 for a sorcery. You manifest Dread, so look at the top 2 cards of your library. Put 1 onto the battlefield face down as a 2/2 creature, and the other into your graveyard. You can turn the 2/2 face up at any time by paying its mana cost if it's a creature, and then you also return a permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. I think this is one of the better return a permanent from your graveyard to your hand for 3 mana spells we've seen in a long time. We usually get a card like this in every set, where for 3 mana you get something back from the graveyard, a permanent specifically usually, and then it's got some kind of, you know, set mechanic tacked on. Tacking on Manifest Dread, though, is actually really good because it puts something into your graveyard so you can find the thing that you want to bring back, while also giving you a body so that you're not playing this 3-drop thing that doesn't impact the board at all, and that body does have the potential of being an even bigger threat that could be turned up at a later date and just turned into whatever creature it is if you happen to hit the creatures. So it's actually a lot of value tacked into 1 card, and I think it's probably the best version of a card like this we've seen in a long time. I think it's going to be easy for people to overlook this in limited at first, because usually cards like this aren't very high picks, but when you really start to think about the Manifest Dread and the board presence that brings, the potential board presence it brings later if the creature you hit is really good, and the fact that you can enable itself by putting something into the graveyard so you can play it even when your graveyard's empty. Like, when you start to really look at all of those ways in which this becomes valuable, I actually think this card is a high pick in limited. Not necessarily a first pick, but really, really good. I think any deck that's in green, that's running a fair amount of permanents, which should be pretty much every green deck in limited, is probably going to want to pick this relatively high. But next up, we've got Piggy Bank. I love this card so much. What I love most about it is that it's, whether willingly, whether knowingly or not, it's a reference to one of my favorite streamers, Hamhawks42, who has an alternate personality, we'll call it, by the name Piggy Banks, that he does a lot of shorts with. He evaluates cards, new cards, as this alternate persona, Piggy Banks. And if you haven't seen those videos, they're super funny. I recommend you check out Hamhawks42 for sure. I'll link it in the comment section. But this card, even outside of that, super awesome. A 3/2 for 2 mana is already pretty good. The fact that it counts as an artifact makes it a little bit better because it's going to enable, you know, any kind of artifact synergies whatsoever. But what makes this card insane, both flavorfully and mechanically, is that when it dies, you create a treasure token. This is super powerful for an uncommon. This is going to be a very high pick in limited. The fact that it gives you a permanent, that permanent trades up really well, counts as an artifact. When it dies, it replaces itself with another permanent that also counts as an artifact for more artifact synergies. And that artifact happens to be something you can sack to not only ramp you to casting a spell a turn earlier if you've got a bomb in your hand, but also mana fixing you to cast a spell you don't have the land for yet if you don't have that color. It just kind of does everything. Being able to get a treasure token on the back of a relevant 2-drop threat that can trade up well, that is statted really well for 2 mana, is awesome. It's just awesome. Just pick the card in Limited and play it. I actually think this will probably show up in Constructed as well, specifically in decks that really care about artifacts with like an Artifact Matters sub-theme, where you can get even more value out of it being an artifact and giving you an artifact when it dies. So expect that to happen. We're definitely going to have to make some kind of an artifact deck that utilizes this. Hopefully in early access we'll get to it. But this card's awesome, and Hamhawks 42 is awesome, so check them out. Next up, we've got Unholy Lobby and Ritual Chamber. This is another enchantment room. Unholy Lobby is 1 black and 2, and at the beginning of your end step, you draw a card. If you control a demon, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. Otherwise, you lose 2 life. So you always draw a card no matter what. If you don't have a demon, you lose 2 life. So it's a little bit worse than a Phyrexian Arena. You're losing double the life. But if you do have a demon, it's way better than Phyrexian Arena. It's the same amount of mana, less color stipulations, and instead of losing any life at all, you drain for 2, right? They lose 2 and you gain 2. And then, as if that wasn't enough, the other side, Ritual Chamber, is 2 black and 3 for an enchantment room, and when you unlock this door, create a 6/6 black demon creature token with flying. So a 6/6 flying demon token for 5 mana is kind of good on its own when it's attached to a Phyrexian Arena that, when you do have the demon token on the battlefield, also drains for 2, is insane. What I love about this card the most is the fact that even if you have to go a few turns with this thing making you lose 2 when you draw your card, eventually you get that demon on the battlefield, and now you start to gain back all the life you lost. So if you lose 2 life for 2 turns in a row, then you get the demon, and you keep a demon on the battlefield for 2 turns in a row, you're back up to where you started, but made them lose 4 life in the process, and have been drawing cards the whole time, and have a 6/6 flying demon. I don't know, the card just seems insane to me. Since the demon's a token, this can work with token tribal, things like Caretaker's Talent, and that seems amazing. It's a super good target to copy for just 1 mana, with level 2 of Caretaker's Talent, so I don't know, I think Demon Tribal could be a thing if we see a lot more crazy demons pop up, which is possible. We've seen a lot of the set, we haven't seen a ton of demons. We saw Valgavoth, so I don't know how probable that is at this point, but it is possible that there's enough demons for a Demon Tribal deck, and that would be cool. I just think at the end of the day, this card's insane. Absolutely insane. Obviously, the more consistently you can play demons, the better it gets. But even if Ritual Chamber gives you your only demon in the deck, I think it still might be possibly worth playing. It's just that good. It's just that good. This card's a slam dunk. But we're gonna move on. Next up, we've got Fear of Surveillance. This is 1 white and 1 for a 2/2 enchantment creature nightmare with vigilance, and when it attacks, surveil 1. This is really good as a common. It's gonna trigger all of your eerie stuff. It's gonna be an attacker and a blocker, and a thing that fills up your graveyard for Delirium and Threshold and Flashback, and a thing that basically scries you into finding your bomb quicker. Just kind of does everything you want in a deck in this format, especially being an enchantment. So I think this is going to be a pretty high pick for common, for a common in particular. That being said, it is kind of still just filler. You know, there are going to be a lot better uncommons and rares that you can be trying to grab earlier in a draft. But as far as commons go, I actually think this is better than most of them. Next up, we've got Splitskin Doll. This is 1 white and 1 for a 2/1 artifact creature toy, and when it enters, you draw a card, then discard a card unless you control another creature with power 2 or less. I kind of love this. It's just a 2-power 2-drop that, if you have another creature with power 2 or less, just draws you a card when you play it. So it's kind of like the Pupper that just rotated out of Standard that came in Kamigawa, except it's got 2 power instead of 1, and it's got a hoop to jump through in order to keep the thing that you draw, right? But even if you don't have a power 2 or less creature, you still get to loot, right? You still get to draw a card and discard a card. And in some decks, specifically in this set, that's actually going to matter. Again, for things like Delirium and Threshold and Flashback and all that good stuff. So the discard isn't as big of a downside as it would be in other sets. And sometimes you're just going to be able to straight up draw a card and still have a 2-power creature for your 2 mana. Honestly, that 2 power makes a huge difference. It doesn't seem it, but being able to have a relevant board threat on the board that can contend with your opponent's 2-drop while drawing a card to replace itself is actually pretty substantial, especially in limited. So I actually think this card is a decently high pick. It's just really good. But next up, we've got Clammy Prowler. This is 1 blue and 3 for a 2/5 enchantment creature horror. And when it attacks, another target attacking creature can't be blocked this turn. So it's got a decently high toughness at 5 toughness, so it's not as big a deal that they can still block this thing. But being able to make any attacking creature not be blocked can be pretty substantial. I think most of the time this is going to be like a very late draft pick to fill out your curve in a deck that maybe cares about enchantments. But there are going to be some times where you're going to want to draft this a little bit sooner, particularly if you're in a deck that has a lot of on-combat damage triggers, where you have creatures where if they get through for damage, they get significant value out of it by a trigger. You can make sure they get through for damage with this. So in that kind of a deck, this goes up in value a little bit. So kind of pay attention while you're drafting, because if you start to notice that your deck is moving in that direction, maybe pay a little bit more attention to the Clammy Prowler and make sure to snatch at least one of these up before the draft is over. Next up, we've got Twist Reality. This is 2 blue and 1 for an instant, and you get to choose one, either counter a spell or manifest dread. I kind of love this, especially at the common slot, because you can grab it pretty late in the draft, I think. But being able to counter a spell for 3 mana, which is somewhat on rate for a counter spell, not necessarily on rate for the best counter spells that you would use in Constructed, but on rate for your normal run-of-the-mill counter spell, that just has an alternate mode that can give you board presence, is actually significant. And if you really need to get something into your graveyard, it's also really good to manifest the dread for that. Like, if you're ready to just, you know, reanimate some crazy big creature or something like that, and you just need something in the graveyard, you can do a lot worse than to just instant speed manifest dread. And that's another thing you gotta keep in mind. It's not just a 2/2. It's basically a 2/2 with flash, since this is an instant speed spell. So it's a 2/2 with flash that you can wait until after you make sure you don't need to counter anything to play. That also puts something in the graveyard, and then turns into probably a much better creature later on. So again, you really need to look at Manifest Dread under more of a microscope to realize how good it is, because I think it's a lot better than it looks on the surface, and because of that, I think this card is better than it looks on the surface. It's still going to be something that you're going to want to pick up later in the draft, but don't discount it completely, because I do think it's worth playing. Next up, we've got Commune with Evil. This is actually a card we saw a few days ago, but it was only available in a foreign language, so we had to wait for the English version to drop. This is 1 black and 2 for a sorcery. Look at the top 4 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, the rest into your graveyard, and you gain 3 life. This is really nice if you have a deck that cares about life gain triggers. Being able to just trigger that kind of for free while finding the best card in the top 4, while also filling up your graveyard for Delirium and Threshold and all of that, can actually be really good in just the right deck. So if you're in just the right deck where all of that matters, you're going to want to pick this pretty high. But otherwise, you could do a lot worse than to pick this up kind of later in the draft as a filler bit of, I wouldn't say card advantage, but card selection. Dig for your bomb in limited, that can be really strong, so this might see some play. But next up, we've got Given to Violence. 1 black and 1 for an instant. Target creature gets +2/+2 and lifelink until end of turn. This is just your common combat trick that you grab if you're desperate towards the end of a draft where you don't have enough removal or combat tricks and you kind of need to fill in that removal suite trickiness aspect of your deck. You grab one of these late in the draft, you fill it in. Sometimes you're going to be able to use it in the middle of combat to blow out your opponent, kill their creature, yours survives, and then gain a bunch of life so that maybe you're winning a race that you otherwise would have been losing. So nice little combat trick. It'll work decently well in the decks that it needs to, that you're desperate to find some kind of a combat trick for late in a draft. But next up, we've got Hand That Feeds. 1 red and 1 for a 2/2 mutant with Delirium. A mutant, that's fun. Whenever Hand That Feeds attacks while there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, it gets +2/+0 and Menace until end of turn. So this is another one of those cards that's just really good in the Delirium deck. If you can get to Delirium super fast, this is just going to be a 4/2 Menace creature for 2, which is kind of insane, honestly. And you gotta remember, it's not as hard to get to Delirium in Limited in this set as it appears. Every time you see that Delirium requires 4 or more card types, it's very easy to immediately have your brain kind of go to, this doesn't work until I have 4 cards in the graveyard, which is actually a fair bit. And just kind of off the cuff taking it like that, I think is doing the ability a disservice, because in this set there are so many cards that have 2 creature types. There are a ton of enchantment creatures. There are artifact creatures. There's even an enchantment land. There's a lot of potential to make Delirium turn on with just 3 cards in your graveyard, and there's actually a chance you can get it to turn on with just 2 cards in your graveyard. That won't happen very often, but the consistency of doing it with 3 is actually pretty substantial. So you kind of need to look at these Delirium cards under a bit of a different microscope than you would if this was just in any other set. A 4/2 Menace that gets turned on for, we'll say, probably 3 cards in your graveyard is actually way better for 2 mana. So I actually think this will be a fairly high pick common in Limited. It's not going to be a high pick in general. It's still going to be only a high pick for common. It's still a common. You know, you're probably still going to want to pick it up to just sort of fill in your curve. But you could do a lot worse than to grab this. I think it'll be pretty powerful. Next up, we've got Reluctant Role Model, our next rare. This card is insane. A 2/2 human survivor for 1 white and 1, and it has survival. At the beginning of your second main phase, if Reluctant Role Model is tapped, put a flying, lifelink, or +1/+1 counter on it. The fact that this can get evasion, lifelink for winning the race against your opponent, or a counter is kind of nuts. You get the versatility to choose what order you get those things in, which is part of what makes that so good. And again, you can trigger the survival ability by finding other ways to tap the creature. You don't necessarily have to swing in. So it's possible that the first turn you have this in play, you tap it with some other ability, trigger the survival, give it a flying counter, and then at that point it can start triggering its own survival triggers because it can swing in every turn in the air when they don't have a flying blocker and just start to accrue these survival counters every single turn. All of that's pretty good on its own, but the second ability is where this card just gets insane. Whenever a Reluctant Role Model or another creature you control dies, if it had counters on it, put those counters on up to 1 target creature. This is just insane. It would be really good if it was just when Reluctant Role Model dies, you put the counters on another creature, but it turns it on for every creature with counters on it. That is what makes me realize this card is insanely pushed, and I think Wizards is trying to push counters as an archetype in Standard, specifically because of that extra line of text, because this card is really good even without that. They didn't need to go the extra mile to make it so that it gives that ability to all of your creatures with counters on it, but they did. So clearly, they want things to change in Standard. They want Standard to twist in a way where this +1/+1 counter deck really actually has a chance and starts showing up in the Standard meta. It's pretty obvious to me because that ability is just insane. So this card absolutely needs to be brewed in Standard, 100% in a +1/+1 counter matters deck, or in a survival deck, in a saddle deck with mounts. That's like probably the best way to trigger survival, honestly. Just mount one of your, mount creatures, just use the saddle ability. This becomes tapped, your mount becomes way better, gets to trigger something, post combat it's tapped, you get to trigger the survival ability. All of that is just insane. So we're gonna have to brew something like that in early access for sure, some kind of a mount/survival hybrid deck. I think it's gonna be awesome. make sure you join us for early access on September 18th, 24-hour marathon stream, because we'll absolutely brew that, along with a whole bunch of other crazy brews I've been coming up with. So this is going to be nuts in Standard for sure. Obviously, the Slam Dunk in Limited, you don't even have to ask that question. Card's just bananas. Absolutely bananas. But next up, we've got Bashful Beastie. This is 1 green and 4 for a 5/4 beast, and when it dies, you manifest dread. Again, we've talked about how good Manifest Dread is and how it's better than it looks on the surface, specifically because of the set that it's in and the limited format it's going to be available in. So a 5-power creature that allows you, you know, 4/5 mana that allows you to Manifest Dread for free when it dies is actually going to be pretty good, I think. So again, another pretty high pick common in Limited. Next up, we've got Overgrown Zealot, 1 green and 1 for a 0/4 elf druid that can tap for a mana of any color, but it can tap for a mana, 2 mana of any one color if you spend that mana only to turn permanents face up. This card is bananas. You can use it as a mana dork for anything. A 2 mana fixing mana dork, but it's also a 0/4. You could theoretically just keep this up as a blocker against aggro for the first 5 turns and put off their kill clock by so much, and still use the mana for instant speed things. And if you're in a deck that wants to use Manifest Dread, we've actually seen a fair amount of instant speed Manifest Dread, so the idea of being able to then use the mana at instant speed to Manifest Dread, and then still hold it up as a blocker the next turn, and use the mana to turn something face up, I don't know, all of that seems really good. Anything that has the potential to give you 2 mana as a 2-drop is definitely worth taking note of, and trying to not break, but, you know, bend and really find ways to just make it super good, especially in Limited. I think this card's going to be awesome. I can't wait to play this in Limited specifically. I don't know if it makes the cut in Constructed, but it's possible there is a Disguise / Manifest Dread Cloak kind of deck that this is worth playing in. We'll have to wait and see. Next up, we've got Growing Dread. Speaking of Manifest, this is 2 mana in the colors of Simic for an enchantment with Flash. When it enters, you Manifest Dread, and whenever you turn a permanent face up, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So now we're really starting to see this Manifest Dread archetype within Limited really take shape. This is insane. You gotta remember, since the enchantment has Flash, you can look at that Manifest Dread creature, that 2/2, as a little bit better than just a normal vanilla 2/2, because it's basically a 2/2 Flash creature, while also being a bigger creature, potentially, when you turn it face up later, getting that value, putting something in the graveyard, getting that value, and then just getting this static ability online that whenever any permanents turn face up, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on it. All of that's insane. This is going to be the backbone and a very high pick for the Manifest Dread archetype within Limited for sure. And if there was any card that gave, you know, the face down archetype a chance, a college try, so to speak, in Constructed, in Standard, this is definitely that card. We're definitely going to have to brew that now. We're definitely going to have to brew some crazy Disguise Manifest Dread Cloak style deck in Standard. I was on the fence about it. I was thinking about it. I have a couple of decks up on the channel already that we did that with over a couple different sets. Thunder Junction and Karlov Manor, I believe. But we're going to have to revisit some of that because it's just getting so much support now. And this card in particular is just bananas if used right. So very high pick, you know, if you're in that archetype in Limited, and probably worth considering for Constructed. I don't know if that deck's going to be quite good enough to contend with the meta, but it definitely has the potential in Standard, and we're going to brew it and we're going to find out. But next up, we've got Bear Trap. 1 mana for an artifact with Flash. You can pay 3, tap it, sacrifice it to deal 3 damage to target creatures. So, nice little bit of instant speed removal that's available in any deck. Any, you know, colorless mana can go in any color deck at all. So this is sort of your filler removal. If you're super desperate, you know, late in a draft, you can pick this up to fill in your removal suite, and it can fit into just any deck at all. So it's overcosted, but it's worth it. And it's nice that you don't necessarily have to pay 4 mana for 3 damage removal at instant speed, because you can just flash this in like earlier in the game and then later on just only pay the 3 mana, so there's a little bit of versatility there, and that's nice. But if you're desperate for removal, you see one of these a little bit later in the draft, snag it up. Next up, we've got Terramorphic Expanse. It has been reprinted. This is just a colorless land. You tap it, sacrifice it, search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. Nothing crazy here, but it will be nice and limited to help you color fix. Maybe possibly allows for 3 color decks in limited. And what I like most about this card is just the art and sort of the flavor of Terramorphic Expanse within this plane, within this set specifically, since the entire plane is one giant haunted mansion. Terramorphic Expanse is this weird, you know, this weird vibe of almost like an MC Escher painting of, you know, staircases that go to nowhere and different rooms turning into other rooms, and it fits flavorfully very, very well, so really cool. Next up, we've got Lionheart Glimmer. This is a 2/5 enchantment creature cat glimmer for 2 white and 3. It has Ward 2, and whenever you attack, creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. This feels like another filler card, which is weird because it's an uncommon. So I'm not sure if this is maybe better than it appears on first glance, but at first glance, it feels a little too expensive. A 2/5 with Ward 2 for 5 mana. Yeah, it counts as an enchantment, but I'm not sure. If there's any way in which this card ends up being a little bit better than it looks, it's in that trigger. Whenever you attack, all creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. But even then, I'm not sure. I guess if there's an archetype where creature tokens are very prevalent and you're able to go really, really wide really quick with a bunch of creature tokens, maybe this gets a lot better. Maybe this is a finisher in that deck that allows your whole board to get bigger and you get that much more value out of it. But I'm not entirely sure. So as it stands, I feel like this is kind of one of the more meh uncommons we've seen. That being said, it's still worth considering. It still counts as an enchantment. It still has a big butt. It still has a relevant attack trigger even if you're not going super wide. So another thing to consider that does make this a little bit better is it doesn't need to attack itself in order to get that trigger, right? So it can just stay back as a decent 2/5 blocker with that Ward 2 that makes it a little harder to kill. And you can just attack with whatever you want to and still get that attack trigger. So that does make it a little bit better. It also counts as a glimmer, and there are some cards that care about you having glimmer on the battlefield, so it could matter for that. So I suppose at the end of the day, this could end up mattering in like a glimmer deck. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But next up, we've got another rare. This is the Mind Render, and this is a card that I had to translate myself, so if the translation's not 100% accurate, please excuse that, but I'm pretty sure it is. This is a 10/1 legendary enchantment creature Nightmare for 3 blue mana. That's already insane. A 10/1 for 3, and because it's 3 blue mana, it really wants to be in like a mono blue deck, or maybe in a 2-color deck that's heavily tilted towards blue. So keep all of that in mind, but a 10/1 for 3 is still pretty nuts. The Mind Render can't be blocked. If a source you control would deal damage to an opponent, prevent that damage, and each opponent mills that many cards. So pretty interesting here. The fact that you mill your opponent's cards instead of doing damage means it wants to be in a mill deck, because as soon as this is on the battlefield, all of the damage you're doing starts milling. So if you're just trying to play this in a normal deck, you're kind of increasing your opponent's life total to however big their deck size is, which isn't that great. But if you're using this in a deck that's already trying to mill out your opponent, and this just adds even more fuel to that, where not only can this swing in and mill your opponent for 10 if it connects, but also all of your creatures that swing in are getting to mill from even more cards. You know, if you're already playing a bunch of stuff that's trying to mill them out, that's just even more milling. It's just extra. So in a deck that's very built around just wanting to mill already to begin with, this could be really cool. It's worth noting that regardless of the fact that it mills instead of dealing combat damage to an opponent, in combat with a creature, it'll still deal its full 10. So you could hold this back as a blocker and trade it for like a 10/10 that's attacking you if you wanted. And being able to do that with only a 3-drop is actually kind of cool. I don't know how often that will be relevant or come up, but it is a thing that you can do. Another thing that I want to note is, even though this makes it so that, you know, when it deals damage to an opponent, you mill that many cards instead, you could sacrifice it. You could sacrifice it to like a fling effect, and I'm pretty sure that because this permanent is off the battlefield, when the fling spell resolves, the damage will actually stick as actual damage and won't mill them. So it might be possible to make some kind of crazy fling combo deck where you're using this as one of your payoffs, where you can just sacrifice it to do 10 damage to your opponent when they're at 10 or less and just finish them off. That would be pretty cool too. So there are definitely some ways to brew around this and to utilize this that are a bit deeper than it appears on the surface. So keep that in mind. It'll be fun to brew around it. If you've got ideas, definitely let me know in the comments, because I feel like there's more we can do with this card that we're not quite realizing yet, and I'm excited to find that out. But at the end of the day, a 10-1 for 3 mana is just rad, and I'm glad it exists. Next up, we've got Creeping Peeper. This is 1 blue and 1 for a 2/1 eye, and you can tap it to add a blue mana, but spend that mana only to cast an enchantment spell, or unlock a door, or turn a permanent face up. So I like this card a lot. It is a decent powered 2-drop. It's something that can trade on rate with another 2-drop, but it can also tap for mana to help you ramp into multiple archetypes in Limited, which is what makes it cool. You could be in the room deck, and this will work because it helps you unlock rooms. You could be in an enchantment deck that isn't using very many rooms, and it's still going to matter because you can use that mana to cast enchantments. You can even just be in the Manifest Dread deck in Limited and not be using that many enchantments or rooms at all, and still get a lot of value out of this, because it can basically let you, you know, turn something face up for a whole 1 less mana by tapping for a mana to use to turn it face up. So it could be really good in that deck too. I love seeing this sort of card not being relegated to one specific archetype, right? It's usable in a few different archetypes in a few different ways, while still having 2 power as a 2-drop and being able to trade decently well with other 2-drops. So I actually think this is a fairly good card in common, and if I think if you're in any of those 3 archetypes, you'll probably end up picking it up as one of the, you know, better commons, one of the more higher priority commons. Still not like a high pick or anything like that, but definitely really, really good support for the decks that want it. Next up, we've got Daggermaw Megalodon. This is clearly a poke at Jaws, right? It has to be. This is a 5/7 shark with vigilance for 2 blue and 4. Honestly, not that bad, even just as a creature there. But it also has island cycling for 2. So what makes this really good is, if you have it early in the game, it's not a dead card. Most of these expensive creatures, they would be a dead card in your Limited deck early in the game, and you might have to play something now to contend with the board state, but you just don't have enough mana, and this thing just sits there, and by the time you can play it, you're already dead. Feels really bad, but with the island cycling too, that's not the case. So if you have it early, you can just island cycle it to ramp up to the mana you need, so that if you happen to draw into a second copy, then you have enough mana to probably play it. You can also island cycle it if, you know, you're missing blue mana entirely, so it can kind of help fix you in a deck that's maybe like 3 colors or something, help you fetch that island. But it can also just be this thing that helps ramp you a little bit early, or color fix you early, that if you happen to draw it late game, where you're out of gas and you have enough mana, it's not just a ramp mana fix card, right? It can come down as a serious threat. So I like the versatility of all of these, you know, land cycling, expensive creatures, because they can fill a lot of different roles in a deck, and I think that makes them way better than they otherwise would be. So you should probably be playing this in your Limited deck. But next up, we've got Glimmer Burst. This is 1 blue and 3 for an instant. You draw 2 cards and create a 1/1 white Glimmer enchantment creature token. Again, certain decks are going to like this more than others. Instant speed, draw 2 cards is pretty decent though. But a lot of decks are gonna like just like having a free 1/1, or what feels like just a free 1/1, a little bit of extra value. But if you're in the Eerie deck, creating an enchantment creature token, triggering all your Eerie triggers, especially the fact that you can do it at instant speed. There are a lot of Eerie cards that only trigger once a turn, so if you can trigger it on your turn, but then you just need an instant speed way of triggering it on their turn, you could do that with Glimmer Burst, so the value starts to go up when you start thinking about those ways of using this card. And then there are some decks that are going to care about Glimmer creature tokens to begin with that get you extra value if you already have a Glimmer creature on the battlefield. So being able to kind of get a head start with a card like this and getting out, you know, a Glimmer creature just sort of for free. And then all of your things that care about Glimmer creatures are just kind of like turned on, and you don't have to worry about playing a card specifically to get a Glimmer creature so that you can do that. You just kind of get it for free while you're drawing your 2 cards with Glimmer Burst. So that makes it go up a little bit in value. So I think if you're in a deck that's trying to utilize all of those bits of silver lining value that I just brought up all in the same deck, this actually goes up in value, and it's not just a like end of the draft pick. It could actually be a more substantial pick. Still not like a crazy high pick or anything like that, but a more substantial mid-draft pick. But that being said, most of the time you're going to grab this late in the game, you know, if you're short on card advantage. And that's it. But next up, we've got Glimmer Light. This is a 2-mana artifact equipment. When it enters, you create a 1/1 white Glimmer enchantment creature token, and then equipped creature gets +1/+1, and you can equip for just 1 mana. I kind of love this card. You get 2 permanents. 2 permanents for 1 card for 2 mana, and one of those is an artifact. The other one is an enchantment and a creature. 3 permanent types. I kind of just love everything about this. Being able to make an enchantment creature token for so cheap triggers things like Eerie. I just sort of love it. And it's really cheap to equip, so it's really easy for a limited deck to just take its 1 extra mana that's left over and just pop this onto something and make what might not quite be a relevant threat maybe get big enough just barely to be a relevant threat now. So I like this card a lot. I like it a lot more than most of the equipments we've seen at the common rarity in the past however many sets. So pretty cool. Still not gonna quite make the cut and constructed, I don't think, although if there's a deck that cares about artifacts and enchantments at the same time, being able to get 1 of each on the field with this thing is actually kind of substantial if that deck exists. That deck definitely existed before rotation, but since rotation we've lost a bunch of cards, and I don't think it does anymore. But if there is a deck that cares about going wide with enchantments and artifacts at the same time, this card could see play in constructed. Next up, we've got Diversion Specialist. This is a 4/3 human warrior with menace for 1 red and 3. So it's already a solid card in limited. 4-drop, 4/3 menace. Let's go. You can also pay 1, sacrifice another creature or enchantment, exile the top card of your library. You may play it this turn. What's awesome about this ability is you can use it at instant speed. It doesn't have to be used at sorcery speed, which means if your opponent tries to kill something with removal, you just pay 1 and sack it in response and get some card advantage off of it. Or hopefully get some card advantage off of it, right? It's kind of amazing. The more I think about it, that's pretty bananas. If you can just hold up 1 mana at all times, you always have the ability. Although you're going to need more mana to play it. It's not the end of until the end of your next turn you can play that card. You have to play it this turn specifically. But honestly, it'd probably be too good if you could play it until the end of your next turn. So even just getting the opportunity to do it until end of turn on a body that's already really good for its cost, it's going to be a knockout in limited. I'm telling you right now, this card will be really good in limited. Not only that, but you can use it in a sacrifice deck, right? You can make like an aristocrat style deck where you have things you want to sacrifice and you're just getting value off of sacrifice triggers and also getting something else to play that turn. So I think it's pretty important that it only costs 1 colorless. Most of the time you're going to have enough mana left over to play whatever you happen to hit, and that is huge. So this card's just everything. It gives you your sack value, it gives you a little bit of removal protection under the right circumstances, and it's just a really good body. So yeah, draft this high and play it. Next up, we've got another enchantment room. This is Greenhouse and Rickety Gazebo. Greenhouse is 1 green and 2 For an enchantment room, lands you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color. So what's worth noting here is it doesn't ramp you at all. You still have the same amount of mana that you had before you played it, and that's a little bit of a bummer, but it does fix you completely, which is nice. What does Rickety Gazebo do? 1 green and 3, and when you unlock this door, mill 4 cards, then return up to 2 permanent cards from among them to your hand. I feel like it's possible this makes the cut in the room deck in Standard if that deck ends up being real, just because of both the color fixing and how this is like almost like a pseudo tutor. It can mill for the rooms that you're missing in a way and get them back out of your graveyard, which is nice. All of the rooms are permanent, so you can hit any rooms you need to with that ability. So it might make the cut there. In Limited, it's a little trickier. I think not getting any value whatsoever out of that first side is a little rough. And the second side kind of being a very huge tempo loss to do the thing is a little rough too. That being said, if you're trying to play 3 colors or more, and you're in a deck that cares about having like Delirium, having things in your graveyard, I think if those 2 things line up, this card might be usable in Limited and might be worth grabbing. You can get card advantage off the second half, you can color fix if you're in 3 color or more off the first half, and you can get stuff into your graveyard that you need there for Delirium. So it's possible this makes the cut in something like that. That being said, both sides are a tempo loss, and that's really, really hard to come back from, so jury's kind of out, but there's potential. Next up, we've got Sawbladeskin Ripper. This is a 3/2 human assassin with menace for 3 mana in the colors of Rakdos, and it has pay 2, sacrifice another creature or enchantment, put a +1/+1 counter on Sawbladeskin Ripper. So it's nice having a sacrifice outlet here for, you know, if you're in the archetype where you're going to want to be a sacrifice deck and you're going to need to come up with a number of outlets so that you can consistently be able to sacrifice things in the deck. And the fact that this just gets bigger and bigger when you sacrifice things is nice. It's already a decent relevant threat as a 3/2 menace for 3. So all of that is awesome. And of course, it being an assassin is awesome because Assassin Tribal, like I already pointed out, I'm excited to explore that more. But this second ability is what makes it really good. At the beginning of your end step, if you sacrificed 1 or more permanents this turn, Sawbladeskin Ripper deals that much damage to any target. So no matter what, you're always dealing 1 damage for every single thing you sacrifice. It's just, it waits until end of turn to tally it up, and then you have to take that bundle of damage and shoot it at 1 specific target. But that target can be anything. It can be the opponent's head, it can be a planeswalker, it can be a battle, it can be a creature, obviously. I think the more I look at this card, the more I like it. At first, I was a little worried because it didn't just trigger every single time you sack something and let you do 1 damage to something. It triggers all at once at the end, which means Sawbladeskin Ripper does have to survive until the end step, right? If you sacrifice a bunch of things, and then during your second main phase, your opponent just kills it, or if it dies in combat or something like that, you don't get the trigger. That's a little bit rough. But that being said, you still get all of the value if you can keep this guy alive. Every single thing you sacrifice will count towards damage to something at the end of your turn, no matter what, even if it's not triggering right away. So with that in mind, I actually like this a lot better. You're getting payoff for everything you've sacrificed ever, if you can just keep him alive. Her alive. So yeah, I kind of love this card. I like it enough that I really want to try to brew an Aristocrats deck in Standard with this. My editor, Finn, also really wants to brew Aristocrats with a card like this, so we're probably going to do that during Early Access, and it's going to be super fun. Will it be good enough in Standard? We're going to find out. In Limited, if you're in the Sacrifice archetype, this is a slam dunk. It's a very high pick. You're going to want to grab it before it's gone because it's going to be insane. Being able to use this as removal just by doing the things you want to do in your deck anyway, if you built it properly, is going to be nuts. But next up, we've got another rare, And I believe this is the last card of the day, Nashi, Searcher in the Dark. This is a 2/2 legendary rat ninja wizard with menace for 2 mana in the colors of Dimir. And when Nashi, Searcher in the Dark deals combat damage to a player, you mill that many cards. You may put any number of legendary or enchantment cards from among them into your hand. If you didn't put any cards into your hand this way, you put a +1/+1 counter on Nashi. This card is way better than it looks. I posted the spoiler short of this up already, and I was getting a lot of comments about how it's just not that good. Not nearly as good as people expected a Nashi to be. But you gotta remember, the best part about this card is its creature types. Rat Tribal is insane right now. Having another relevant, threatening rat in the 2-drop slot that can just get you card advantage over and over and over every turn, or grow over and over and over every turn, is significant. Also, the fact that it's a ninja is huge because we have the new 𝐼𝐾𝐄. And if you guys have seen the new 𝐼𝐾𝐄, if you haven't, check out my very first day 1 spoiler video. I'll make sure to link that in the description. Check that out where we go over 𝐼𝐾𝐄, because 𝐼𝐾𝐄 specifically has a really powerful uptick ability where you get an emblem where all ninjas get +1/+1, and because it's an uptick ability, you can use it every single turn. And people don't realize how crazy that is because there aren't very many ninjas that are in standard right now. They are very, very rare, hard to come by. We looked it up. I think there are only 3 outside of the 𝐼𝐾𝐄 card himself. But now with Nashi here, we have 4, and that's huge because those emblems, you can't get rid of them at all once you have them. And it's so easy to just get another one, another one, another one every single turn, that your ninjas become an insane force to reckon with. Like, just getting free anthems every single turn for your ninjas is nuts. So the closer we can get to making Ninja Tribal work with the new 𝐼𝐾𝐄, the more insane that's gonna be. Nashi gives us another really solid ninja that has evasion, that gets us card advantage every turn or just gets bigger, that capitalizes on all of those emblems. So Nashi's gonna be insane in ninjas. Nashi's going to be really, really good in Rat Tribal, which is already a really strong deck in the standard meta. And if you guys have been sleeping on Rat Tribal on the standard ladder on Arena, you don't know what you're missing. You got to try it out. I put that deck out a few decks ago. It's up on the YouTube channel, so check that out. I believe it's called The Swarm. Definitely check that out because that deck's insane. Has a crazy high win rate. It's really good, and I don't see it nearly as much as I expected to on the ladder. It's probably one of the better tribal decks, to be completely honest. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. Rat Tribal's going to be awesome with Nashi. Ninja Tribal's going to be awesome with Nashi. But I'm going to try to brew Rat and Ninja Tribal. We use 𝐼𝐾𝐄. We use the few ninjas that we have. We use Nashi. We use a ton of rats. I think it can be bananas. We'll use Mockingbird. But you can also get just insane value off this in a Legendary Matters deck. Legendary Matters decks are huge right now. There are tons of options. There's an embarrassment of riches when it comes to crazy legendary creatures you can be running in like 5-color legendary tribal decks. We still have Plaza of Heroes to help mana fix for that. You know, we still have Joda, all of that stuff. This, getting to hit anything that's legendary and put it into your hand when you mill it, is kind of bananas. It's a 2-drop must-answer threat, or it just starts getting you an insane amount of value over the course of the game. So, when you look at all the different ways this can be good, it's actually nuts. Like, sure, the abilities in a vacuum don't look that crazy, but the creature types are just hugely relevant, and the fact that it's a legendary is hugely relevant, and all of that is huge contributors. Those are huge contributors to how good this card is and should not be overlooked. This card's going to be awesome, and I'm super excited to brew with it. I'm just super excited. Can you tell I'm excited? I love this set. I'm excited. But that's going to do it for today. Thank you so much for checking out the video. It's a lot to get through. It was a lot to get through. We're going to have more spoilers coming as soon as Monday hits, so be ready for that video. More spoiler shorts in the meantime as spoilers are released. You know, we're going to try to get those shorts out to you as quick as we can to be like right on the gun with them. And then, you know, break those down into a longer form video like this one later in the day. So be ready for that. Tons of deck techs are popping. So if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe so you never miss an upload. Make sure you smash that like button so you can help this video get out to that many more people. It's a lot of work putting these together, and I would really appreciate the help. And I will see you on the next one. I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Wonders of the First. Wonders of the First is a brand new collectible card game similar to games like Magic the Gathering, Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon, featuring a unique action-based resource economy that helps avoid pitfalls like Mana Flood or Mana Screw, and a battlefield containing multiple realms that unlock over time as you fight for control of the stones. The first 400 card set is called Existence and will launch to retail in the fall, but playtest team starter kits are available to order now. And they haven't forgotten about all you collectors out there. The game contains alternate borderless art variants, as well as highly sought after limited edition numbered prints, culminating in a one-of-one stone foil. And the best part is that the developers have a community-first approach, with 8 print-and-play decks available on their website, as well as a version of the game available on Tabletop Simulator, all for free. For more information, be sure to check out wondersccg.com today. That's wondersccg.com. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck techs, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.